Welcome to Read News Today. A New York City police officer shot and killed a 69-year-old man who wielded a machete inside a South Bronx apartment on Tuesday morning after officers burst inside searching for drugs and a firearm, the police said. Another man, in his 90s, who was inside the apartment, at 230 Brook Avenue in Mott Haven, was not injured, the police said. A friend said the man had thought the officers were robbers when they broke down the door, so he stayed in bed, fearful of being hurt. He thought it was a robbery, said the friend, Ronald Perez. He said he would have gotten up if he knew it was police. The dead man was identified by the police as Mario Sanabria. The shooting, which unfolded at about 4:10 a.m. inside the third-floor apartment, was the third time in recent weeks that city police officers opened fire on people wielding knives inside the close quarters of residential spaces. The police department has been expanding its efforts to train officers to de-escalate encounters with civilians who are not armed with a gun and to avoid deadly force when possible. On November 13, two uniformed officers from the 48th Precinct, also in the Bronx, shot and killed 67-year-old Cornell Lockhart in the lobby of a building that provides housing services to at-risk and formerly homeless New Yorkers. Mr. Lockhart, who was in declining health, refused orders to drop a steak knife after the police responded to 911 calls for help after Mr. Lockhart stabbed two female security guards. A month earlier, on October 22, a police officer in Manhattan shot and wounded Paris Cummings, 27, inside a narrow sixth-floor vestibule at 610 West 143rd Street, after Mr. Cummings charged at two officers and refused orders to drop two knives. Those officers were responding to calls about a man attempting suicide and in need of help. Each of the two earlier episodes was captured on video by the body cameras the officers were outfitted with. Weeks afterward, the police department released portions of the footage of each of those encounters showing the final moments before the officers fired their weapons. In Tuesday's shooting, however, the police said none of the officers were equipped with the new recording devices, which are being used in about 20 of the department's 77 precincts and by about 1,200 officers in a force of 36,000. About 4 hours after the shooting, the police issued a photograph of the machete, with a 2-foot-long blade, which the police said Mr. Sanabria was wielding when he was shot. Terrence A. Monahan, the department's chief of patrol, said the events began when officers from the emergency service unit arrived at the 4-story building, off East 138th Street, to execute a search warrant to seize a firearm and narcotics. The warrant to search the premises was based on information that a man in his 30s who lives there had a gun and drugs, the police said. Because a firearm was involved, the officers did not announce themselves until after they had forced their way into the apartment, the police said. It remained unclear, however, whether the police team was aware that two older men resided in the apartment, number 11, or had made provisions for such a possibility. As the uniformed officers entered, the first two went down a long hallway ending at a rear bedroom. Once there, they were confronted by Mr. Sanabria with the machete. The man in his 90s was in a different room. The man in his 30s was not inside. The uniformed officers ordered the subject to drop the weapon and he refused to comply, Chief Monahan said. As the subject continued to approach the lead officer, the officer discharged one shot from his service firearm, striking the subject once in the chest. The officer who fired, a member of the emergency service unit, was not identified. In line with new procedures for using force, the officers called for an ambulance for Mr. Sanabria, Chief Monahan said, and administered medical aid. Mr. Sanabria was taken to Lincoln Medical and Mental Health Center, where he was later pronounced dead. Mr. Perez said the man in his 90s was a relative of Mr. Sanabria and the main tenant in apartment 11, and that Mr. Sanabria often stayed there. What relationship, if any, either of them had to the man in his 30s was not immediately clear. At about 6:30 a.m., That younger man showed up on the sidewalk outside the building and was taken to the 40th Precinct Station House for questioning, said Stephen P. Davis, the police department's chief spokesman. Hours later, however, investigators were still processing the scene, and the police could not say whether any drugs or a firearm had been recovered. Mr. Davis declined to say whether the shooting fell within police guidelines. He said an internal review would be carried out by the Force Investigation Division. The shooting will also be reviewed by the Office of the Bronx District Attorney, Darcel D. Clark, who also has open inquiries into the fatal police shootings of Mr. Lockhart and, a month earlier, of Miguel Richards, a 31-year-old college exchange student from Jamaica. At the shooting scene Tuesday, Juan Munoz, 71, the superintendent of the building, said he was downstairs in an adjoining shop when the police, as many as 30 officers, arrived in a caravan of cars. He said they broke down the building's front door even after he offered to unlock it. Mr. Perez, 55, said people in the neighborhood had a real fear of intruders coming at all times of night, and resorting to disguises of all sorts. He said the elderly man told him there were no guns in the apartment. "They're quiet, working people," Mr. Perez said.